Minuilom, everyone. Welcome to our TRC 57 speaker series, Learning with CA at SUS. This is part of Nanaimo Ladysmith Public Schools' efforts to learn how to walk differently on Coast Salish territory. My name's Ted Cadwallader. I'm co-hosting today with my two friends, Tzomquatan, Lawrence Mitchell, and Swichatanat, Stephanie Johnson. As always on Coast Salish territory, I'm going to turn it over to our friend Tzomquatan to open up our house.
Hi, Tzepka, CM Schwalakwa, Atanaquail, Nastlikwinas Tsayat Namit Stuch to Aaron Glass, Andy Everson, Eaton Tiwi Tau at Koslet, Haichka. Chats Alt Main Haichka. Haichka at High L I Squale at an Aquail. Haichka Neats Hilly. Ichwam Tatu with Tau to Eli Nashwalakwa. Ichwam Amastal Aquata Ait Squalawan. Ichwam Quam Stuch to Squalawanst. Ichwam Latlamet that Salelo E Schwawali E Smanamst. Tiwia Zan Quakikalis E Kaki Nastimo. Ichwam Stlatlakan Stoch Donat Hualmo. Haichka Kuts Tua E Atanatamo Atanaquel E to Muxquel. Nawa Squamquam Stanasalit it's a CM Haichka. Oh, 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 Boy, oh, 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 oh,
It's one of the teachings of our territory that we've learned as we've gone along is if that you want the land and the ancestors to join you in what you're trying to accomplish, then you better start off in Hulkameetnam because that's the language that this land speaks. So I'm always pleased to have Lawrence join us, remind us of those protocols of this territory and ask our ancestors and children yet to come to join around us and create this safe space where we can share our learnings as we've gone along. I want to raise my hands and thanks to UBC Press for, again, connecting us with amazing authors. And if you want to get a discount on any of the books, and in this one, Writing the Hamat'sa, then please visit UBC Press's website or the TRC 57 Speaker Series website. It's my pleasure to introduce our two guests today. We'll start off close to home. Aaron's a long ways away from us, but Andy's close to home. Andy Everson, our world-renowned artist, Comox Nation citizen, Hamat'sa himself, and you can see from his background, a Star Wars fan too. And you'll notice that if you've seen any of Andy's artwork too. And Aaron Glass, associate professor at Bard Graduate Center in New York City. So joining us from the other side of the continent, author, learner, teacher, film director in his spare time, I guess. So welcome to you both, Nulilam and Gela Kasla, to you both for joining us today. And the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ted, for the kind introduction, and to Stephanie for the invitation to be here, to Lawrence for the beautiful opening, to Andy for joining me on Zoom again this year to talk about the book, and for your amazing contributions to the book, from which we'll hear about shortly. And to all of you out there who I can't see, thank you for joining us. I'd also just like to start off with a word of thanks to all of the Kwakwaka'wakw people with whom I've worked over the last 28 odd years, without whom the book and much of my other work would not be possible. I obviously the debts of knowledge and sharing and salmon that I've accrued over the years are too great to repay. But I have arranged with UBC Press to share royalties from the book with the Umista Cultural Center, with which I've been worked for many years, and developed a lot of collaborative projects, some of which Andy has also been involved in. So maybe we'll have a little chance to chat about those at the end. I'm just going to share my screen so you have something other than me to look at. Basically, Andy and I are going to talk for about 25 minutes or so about the book. And then we'll open it up to Q&A and conversation. So let me just get myself organized here. Okay. So I actually, I narrate my initial entry into Alert Bay, into Kwakwaka'wakw territory, into studying the Hamat'sa in the book itself, from which I'll read in a moment. But a couple quick words are in order. Today, I am speaking to you not from British Columbia or Kwakwaka'wakw territory, but from my office in Lenape-Hoking, the ancestral territories of the Lenni Lenape people, otherwise known as New York City, on the island of Manhattan. So from one island to another. This book is based on my 2006 dissertation from New York University. And the dissertation was focused on the history of ethnographic representation of the Hamat'sa in various media. So that included written ethnography, but also film and photography, museum collecting and display, non-ceremonial dance performance, all of which are the kinds of topics that I've written about most often. Given the richness of the history of the dance and perhaps the zeal of my engagement with the museum and the archive, as well as with communities, my dissertation got very long, could not be translated into a single book, which is itself too long. So I took some time away from it and I did other projects, and I had kids and all this other kind of stuff. I reimagined the book. and this is the result. So it really, the book as it stands brackets out and revises really the chapters in the dissertation that focused on written ethnography, on the legacy of writing about the Hamat'sa. That's why it's called what it is. And in particular on the Kwakwaka'wakw, the kind of active Kwakwaka'wakw engagement in the ethnographic encounter that resulted in that, in the bulk of that writing, from their participation in sort of knowledge and text production, but also a history of being consumers and critics of anthropological products. And I do hope to do a kind of second related volume called Picturing the Hamat'sa, about the sort of history of visual mediation, images, films, museums, but that's sort of on the back burner for the moment. My goal in the book, as in all of my projects, especially my collaborative projects, has been to sort of, is twofold, both to contribute to a kind of a critical historiography, a critical history of anthropology and its colonial conditions on the one hand, but also to help make the library and archive and collection of ethnographic materials more available and more legible, especially to Indigenous communities, for whom they represent an archive of living culture and possible futures, as well as kind of compromised documentation of the past. And so that's really the kind of intellectual spirit of the project. So with that, I'm just gonna, for about 10-15 minutes, I want to read a few pages from the beginning of the book, and which is called Points of Arrival and Departure. In the late 1870s, an Anglican reverend named Alfred Hall was assigned by the Church Missionary Society to a new post at Fort Rupert, British Columbia, near the north end of Vancouver Island. One day in February 1880, he set off by canoe to conduct a survey of nearby villages for the purpose of expanding his small flock of Indigenous congregants among the Kwakwaka'wakw people of the area. Winter in this territory is the time for Tseika, the sacred red cedar bark ceremonials, and Hall's effort to spread the gospel was limited by intense ritual activity at many of his destinations. He and his crew were fed and allowed to witness ceremonial dances, but in one house, his attempts to offer a hymn were rebuked by the local chief as anathema to those proceedings. Following the journey, Hall wrote to his church supervisors about one particularly harrowing experience. Quote, "Whistling and growling were heard and then followed a terrible scratching at the door. It opened and in sprang a man naked, leaping on his hands and legs and tied around the waist with a long rope held by 6 men. After jumping across the fire 2 or 3 times, he attempted to grasp all present as if to bite them. He clutched hold of my coat, but soon left the house. In a few minutes, another medicine man held by 5 men in the same way went through the same performance. All in the house were frightened and ran away, and I learned afterward that 2 men were bitten that evening." Now, this is obviously a later photo. It was actually taken by George Hunt, who worked with Franz Boas and others, but it stages a similar moment of the dance. Without quite knowing what he had witnessed, and without actually having observed any biting of audience members, Hall became among the first people ever to commit to paper a description of the Kwakwaka'wakw Hamat'sa dance, one of the most prestigious initiation rites within their ranked system of hereditary prerogatives. Thanks in part to Hall's own missionizing efforts and his subsequent cooperation with government agents, the Hamat'sa and the larger ceremonial potlatch in which it is embedded would be outlawed only 4 years later under a new provision in the Canadian Indian Act. Almost as soon as the dance was inscribed in the colonial archive, its enactment became prohibited despite a clear lack of comprehension on the part of federal authorities as to its true nature or purpose, or even its name. The following year, in 1885, a young German scholar named Franz Boas first saw a Northwest Coast cannibal dance performed in Germany by a troupe of traveling Newkolk, which helped spark his interest in the region. In the summer of 1886, only 2 years after the Indian Act was revised, Boas first ventured to British Columbia to begin his ethnographic studies of First Nations languages, ritual, and art. In Victoria, he saw postcards like this one, picturing the dancers he had met in Germany only months prior, already turned into transnational and transcultural souvenirs. Boas quickly decided to focus on the Kwakwaka'wakw, whom he called Kwakiutl in the language of colonial administration, as they appeared to be less assimilated than some of their coastal neighbors, despite the presence of missionaries, settlers, merchants, and Indian agents in their territories. With this trip, Boas initiated a lifetime of research into the Hamat'sa in the colonial context of its prohibition, although the social, cultural, and political reality of this condition rarely animated his otherwise detailed ethnographic descriptions. Partly as a result of his numerous museum exhibits and voluminous publications, as well as his influence on the nascent field of professional anthropology in North America and beyond, the world would soon come to know the Hamat'sa as the cannibal dance, and come to read about it again and again in every generation of anthropological scholarship. And the rest is history, or put another way, a history of ethnography. But it's also the history of this ritual performance and its survival despite prohibition and persecution, a story of Kwakwaka'wakw resilience in the face of colonial assimilation policy and rampant ethnographic representation. Just over a century after Boas's arrival in British Columbia, prospective visitors were offered an intriguing glimpse into the natural and cultural wonders awaiting them. In May 1992, the government of Canada, the world next door, ran a spread in the New York Times Magazine with the tagline, "Only in God's country could you meet such interesting souls." The focal point of the ad is a sweeping scene on a West Coast beach in which three, presumably Indigenous people, are engaged in a dramatic ceremony. A standing figure dons the regalia of a northern chief, while two seated dancers wear the distinctive avian masks called Hamat'sa, used during the particular sequence, the Hamat'sa, of the larger Hamat'sa dance cycle. In a rhetorical move that encapsulates the colonial penchant for paternalist appropriation, semiotic contradiction, and imperialist nostalgia, the text suggests that, quote, "Our native people have been entertaining visitors for centuries," unquote, thereby decontextualizing the specific figures, which are never identified in the ad, neutralizing the ceremonial source of the scene, and ignoring the history of a potlatch ban that persisted until 1951. At the same time, the visible activity is promised to be deeply spiritual in nature, a purportedly traditional or timeless ritual set in semantic opposition to the modern cityscape of Vancouver just below. Though it misidentifies the particular masks pictured, the ad claims that, quote, "The most revered of spirits and master of ceremonies, the raven embodies what this land is today, magic. For here the supernatural abides in all that is living," unquote. While this vaguely animist characterization of both the land and its inhabitants was precisely what Reverend Hall and his government allies fought to replace with bounded reserves and membership in the Anglican Church, here it's both recuperated and reconciled, bridged, as another image in the ad implies, with a Western fantasy of divinely charged landscape. What was once persecuted in BC as a display of savagery unfit for the nascent Christian colony is now used to tease potential tourists with the promise of Indigenous spirituality and aesthetic drama. Illegal in Canada under federal policy meant to hasten the assimilation of Indigenous peoples, the Hamat'sa is now adopted by the state as a picturesque exemplar of national heritage. Although not prompted by the newspaper ad in question, my own entrance into Kwakwaka'wakw territory took place the following year. Nor did I set out initially to do field work there. I decided to balance my early training in anthropology as an undergrad with some exposure to contemporary Indigenous life, and a series of casual travels and social contacts landed me at the north end of Vancouver Island. In June '93, I arrived in Alert Bay to begin a summer of volunteer work at the Umista Cultural Center, the globally renowned museum, library, archive, and cultural resource center that houses potlatch regalia illegally confiscated during the ban and repatriated since the early '80s. In preparation for this summer, I read many of the classic ethnographies. However, nothing could have prepared me for the contemporary ubiquity of the cannibal dance in daily life. Within my first 2 weeks on the Nagedzi Reserve, I witnessed numerous Hamat'sa performances in a variety of cultural and intercultural settings. A huge 2-day potlatch, the cultural celebration held by young children from the local band-run school, a large intertribal canoe journey with First Nations from the entire coast, and dances staged for visiting summer tourists. Each performance was of different length and entailed divergent explanations, as well as variable use of the iconic bird masks. But they all featured the dance of initiates dressed in the characteristic regalia of cedar bark head rings, neck rings, and aprons. After cycling through a series of similar but not identical choreographic routines, the main dancers inevitably went wild and had to be restrained by attendants, just as Hall had witnessed over a century before, although there were no attempts to bite audience members, at least that I witnessed that summer. Having only read of the once outlawed secret society, I was surprised by its regularity and public visibility. I also became increasingly aware of the presence of a vast amount of ethnographic materials throughout Alert Bay and other neighboring communities. Boaz books in institutional and domestic libraries, iconic photographs by Edward Curtis hanging in homes and gift shops, mid-20th century cassette recordings of ceremonial songs played on stereos, bootleg VHS tapes of early documentary films being shown on living room television sets. As another anthropologist working in Kwakwaka'wakw communities has recently observed, the canon, quote, the canon is impossible to avoid. I was repeatedly struck by local modes of promoting culture, as you can see here from the Nagedzi website at the time, a little later in 2006, in both intra and intercultural discourse, by the status of the Hamat'sa as a cultural emblem and badge of pride, and by the invocation of tradition, in some cases with direct reference to ethnographic media during negotiations over current cultural production and political claims to sovereignty. These 4 arrival scenes punctuate the remarkable and at times circuitous, ironic, and contentious story of the Hamat'sa over the past 200 years. And this book explores a number of aspects of its paradoxical history and cultural transformation. How is it that the Hamat'sa dance, the most secretive 19th century Kwakwaka'wakw initiation rite, banned by the Canadian government for its association with cannibalism, is now routinely performed for tourists and at museum openings? By what linguistic legerdemain, sleight of hand, did the indigenous expression of overcoming non-human and inhumane appetites get branded the cannibal dance? How did this highly restricted hereditary prerogative, introduced to the Kwakwaka'wakw in the 19th century and ceremonially available only to the chiefly elite, come to be taught in many band-run schools as a kind of national emblem? And what role, if any, did highly selective, recursive, and objectifying written accounts play in both its suppression and its survival? The dramatic choreography of the dance, the magnificent bird masks, and the aura of cannibalism have all contributed to its allure among non-Indigenous observers. Yet these same features have also encouraged exaggeration, misconstrual, and outright spectacle in the resulting descriptions, whether made in the context of colonial assimilation policy, anthropological analysis, or commercial enticement. This book tracks the Hamat'sa and its dramatic inscriptions, as well as their reception, interpretation, and use across international scholarly and popular texts and back into First Nations communities over 4 centuries. That is the late 18th century to the 21st century. I ask how different modes and media of ethnographic representation are constructed, circulated, and consumed, and how they contribute to the formation of both colonial stereotypes and Indigenous modernities over time. Okay, I'm going to stop reading. Just before I pass it on to Andy, this is a kind of a brief table of contents of the book, just give you a sense of what's in it. There's a foreword by Chief Bill Cranmer of the Umista Cultural Society and the Nagedzi Nation, and the prologue from which I just read the opening couple pages. The introduction to the book lays out my kind of theoretical approach, which I'll spare you in its jargony detail. But there's 2 sort of key ideas in the book that really helped me think beyond a kind of what I think of as a kind of standard post-colonial critique of anthropology. And the first of those ideas is that rather than just critique these texts as inaccurate representations, which they are and which I do, I also think about them as mediations, that is, as kind of negotiated and intermediary forms of knowledge that have their own kind of materiality, their own modes of production and circulation, their own social lives, that these books have social lives, and I'm interested in those lives. And the second idea is that rather than focus only on kind of anthropological authority, I focus on indigenous contribution to an agency in the ethnographic encounter, which I think changes the way that we understand Kwakwaka'wakw relationship, both to the kind of co-production and the consumption of these texts over time. So I'd say those are two of the kind of key theoretical ideas behind the book. Chapter 1, A Complex Cannibal, introduces the dance itself in the context of Kwakwaka'wakw ceremony, colonial modernities, and sort of a European obsession with cannibalism in general. Chapter 2, Discursive Cannibals, surveys a range of colonial writing genres that describe the Hamat'sa in variable sort of moments and settings, giving a sense of the diversity of colonial dynamics and Kwakwaka'wakw responses. So these include fur trade narratives, missionary tracts, settlement prospectuses, amateur ethnography, administrative correspondence, and the popular press. Chapter 3, The Foundation of All Future Researches, provides a kind of perhaps overly comprehensive analysis of the extensive research of Franz Boas and George Hunt, showing how Boas's lifelong attention to the Hamat'sa developed and fundamentally shaped all of the literature that came afterwards. Chapter 4, Reading, Writing, and Writing Against, surveys a century of anthropology in the wake of Boas and Hunt, and how the Hamat'sa became increasingly central and kind of increasingly stereotyped with each new paradigm in the field. Chapter 5, From Index to Icon, juxtaposes a series of Kwakwaka'wakw autobiographies, which tend to treat the Hamat'sa as a kind of complex index of specific family prerogatives, with its increasing presence in popular fiction and poetry, where the dance functions more as a kind of decontextualized and simplified icon, a symbol of authentic Indianness in a way far removed from the ground in communities. And finally, chapter 6, Shaking the Archive, sort of concludes the book with my own ethnographic research and experience in the communities on the reemergence of the Hamat'sa into the public sphere after the Palach ban was dropped in 1951, and the current modes of reception and debate and critique and sort of mobilization of this anthropological library and archive in communities today. The book ends with Andy's afterword and a number of appendices that draw together comparative, unpublished, and archival materials, and a glossary of terms related to the Hamat'sa, which I can talk about a little bit afterwards. So with that, I'm going to mute myself and put on the next slide and pass the Zoom mic over to Andy.
My English name is Andy Everson, but I carry the name Kumhilagilis generally throughout the year. But in the wintertime, I also carry the name Tanis, which essentially means cannibal dancer. And I'm speaking here from Comox territory, the unceded traditional lands of the Comox people. We're the kind of the northernmost Salish people on Vancouver Island. My grandfather was the late Chief Andy Frank. He was chief of the Puntlach people here in Comox territory. And I'm so happy to be here today. I've known Aaron for a long, long time now. Aaron and I went to, we were in graduate school together at UBC, studying anthropology, and that's kind of my background as well. Some people have asked me, you know, how did I get into anthropology of all things? And I kind of, there's a kind of a joke that goes around about families having their own anthropologists and stuff. You know, we grew up around anthropologists. It's not a foreign concept to us. In fact, my grandmother's grandfather was George Hunt, who worked extensively with Franz Boas, the famous anthropologist, as Aaron had mentioned. And so my grandmother, who knew both her grandfather, of course, and Franz Boas and other people that have come into our territories kind of pushed me along this path a little bit in interest in my culture. I grew up in a family where we have traditionally Hamat'sa dancers in our lineage. My grandfather was a Hamat'sa dancer, as was his mother, initiated Hamat'sa dancers. My grandmother's brother was also a Hamat'sa dancer. So it comes kind of naturally to me to speak on this because of that extensive background. When I was 10 years old, I was told to get out and dance and do this kind of the movements of a Hamat'sa, leading out the women, just like my grandfather used to do. And I was put into this dance position. And I was never properly initiated as a Hamat'sa dancer at 10 years old. So I was kind of always in this in-between world of not being fully initiated but having this Hamat'sa position as well. And it wasn't until relatively recently in 2013 that our family hosted a potlatch, and I was to be initiated finally by my uncle, the late Peter Knox. He wanted to put one of his Hamat'sa positions onto me to make sure that it was done right. And as I was preparing for this, I started to kind of balance out knowledge, oral tradition, but also always in mind looking at the textual resources that I have at hand, information that was passed down, from my great-grandfather, recorded information, or great-great-grandfather, George Hunt. And so one of the things that I wanted to do during my initiation was to come through what we call a mawit. And a mawit is a sacred dance room with a painted front, and it has a hole in the center. And you can see in the image on the left of the screen is the mawit that I designed and painted for my initiation. And I went through that whole 16 different times during the course of my initiation in order to become a Hamat'sa dancer. And it represents the face of Kwakwaka'wakw, who's a cannibal at the north end of the world, kind of the governing spirit of the Hamat'sa dancer. In the other picture, you can see the mawit in the background to the left, and that's me dancing the final stage as a Hamat'sa dancer, and we call this a hilik ela. And in front is my sister, Charlene, who is my hilikiste, the one that feeds me when I was going through the initiation process. During my initiation, I spent a good deal of time fasting and bathing in the rivers in order to lead up to this moment. So this is special for me, looking at this picture, surrounded by all of my family, and in the background, my mawit. Can we switch to the next slide? Later on in 2018, I was asked to create an art piece for the Comox Valley Art Gallery. There's a show called Potlatch 6767, and it was about the anti-potlatch law that was brought into place, which lasted some 67 years here in Canada. And I wanted to create a piece that was kind of evoking a sense of concealment, of hiding who we are, of hiding our sacred rituals. And so I created this image on the bottom of a dining room table, because my grandparents continued to potlatch even during the potlatch ban, and they would sit around and they would have tea and invite their friends and family to sit around the dining room table, and they would give names and they would talk about the dances, and later on my grandfather would even record them on this exact reel-to-reel recorder. And all this while, we had to keep this secret society even more secret than it's ever been before, and keep it concealed and hidden away from the public. And the design on this represents again a Maui, the face of Kwakwaka'wakw, with the skull in the mouth of Kwakwaka'wakw. When I was asked to write an afterword for Aaron's book, I of course said yes, because we've had a good friends relationship for a long time, and also I think it's really important that we contribute as Kwakwaka'wakw people to such books. And naturally, he asked me if I wanted to do the cover as well. So I kind of altered this image that I created for concealment, and took this idea of Kwakwaka'wakw and used actual typewritten part of one of Franz Boas's works, and I carefully aligned it so that you could see key words and phrases in the background of this image. And one of the ones that really stuck out was the house of Kwakwaka'wakw. And this became kind of the title of this piece. But there's other words like grizzly bear and dancing, brothers, red cedar bark, the word hop, which is our cry that we say as a Hamat'sa dancer, which means to eat. We're always craving food when we're in that wild state. So that ended up forming the cover of the book. And I just once again want to thank Aaron for asking me to contribute to this wonderful piece. Gaila Kasla.
Thank you, Andy. You enriched the book in numerous ways, and I always love talking about it with you. I just put up the discount code there. It's in the chat too. So if anyone, TRC 57 is pretty easy to remember. Okay, I'll stop the screen share now, and pass it over to Ted, the MC, to guide us further.
That's great. Thanks to you both. An amazing book. I'll have to say up front, not an easy read if you're coming new to the Hamat'sa world or the Kwakwaka'wakw family structures. But if you're somewhat familiar with that, it was a wonderful book and a wonderful walk through history. A couple of themes that came through there that I'd like to pose questions to you both, and please pick them up, whoever would like to pick them up. But one of the themes that stuck out for me was just the perseverance of misinformation and how it takes on its own life. So some of those early descriptions, as you mentioned, from Hall, and how they end up in poetry and metaphor 150 years later, being used so far removed from what the Hamat'sa was there. So maybe just talk a little bit about that perseverance of misinformation as it travels through time.
Yeah, I think one of the real parallels between the aspects of the dissertation and maybe the aspects of this and a potential future book, between the textual kind of stuff and all the visual stuff, was the way in which that same dynamic plays out. And I think I was more aware of it earlier in the visual material, and the way in which, like from that example that I gave, Boas is in Germany in 1885. The New Hulk go to Germany. They dance. They get photographed. 6 months later, Boas is in British Columbia, and those photographs are being sold in German-owned curio shops in Victoria. And then from there, those images of the New Hulk posing in the Hamat'sa masks are among the most widely reproduced early images of First Nations on the coast. They're among the earliest photographs that get circulated a lot. And then a little later, Edward Curtis's images. But so I became very interested in the way in which initially visual material gets recycled, often without citing the sources that they came from. And so by the 1960s and 70s, when a sort of new generation of museum exhibits were going up and documentary films were being made, all of these images from the late 19th century get used, but without the original context in which they were made. They're just like unproblematic glimpses of authentic First Nations life. No indication that some of them were taken in Germany or at the Chicago World's Fair or for commercial film production, right? They're these kind of unproblematic illustrations. And so I think my entry into that dynamic was really through that visual material. But then the more I read, the more I realized there was a similar dynamic happening with the texts, that authors were recycling little fragments of text, often without citing their sources, over and over and over again, generation after generation. And I became interested in that process itself. And so, in a way, the subject of this book is really the history of anthropological knowledge as much as it is the Hamat'sa. It happens to be knowledge about the Hamat'sa, but I very early on, I sort of made a clear decision in my own mind, and I tried to make it clear with the people with whom I worked, that I was not writing a definitive anthropological explanation of the Hamat'sa. That was not my project. It was not my project to do as an outsider. That what I was really trying to look at was a kind of critical history of my own fields, and sort of adjacent fields. And as it happened, the Hamat'sa became the subject for that work because it was the subject for my work, because it was the subject of so much of that work. And that's where, it's sort of the visual and textual processes over a long period of time, which really gave it its iconic status outside of the communities. There's different reasons that it became so important inside communities, and I talk about some of those along the way. Mm-hmm. But that's not primarily the story that I set out to tell.
Aaron, that came clear in the book too, that it was a look at ethnography, and not a review of the Hamat'sa. Andy, do you want to talk a little bit about that perseverance of misinformation? Because I know that sometimes that misinformation in bits and pieces, when you mine it well, becomes useful. And you talked a little bit about that in the preparation for your own Hamat'sa.
Yeah, and one of the things that I kind of address in the afterword is this idea that we're always using, or nowadays we have the privilege of being able to access this information, this textual information from these books that were written. But the crucial point for us is making sure that there's a balance between living oral tradition and what's right and wrong according to the old people, because we don't want to pull up this book written ostensibly by a white guy, Franz Boas, and use it as gospel for our culture and kind of a handbook for our culture, because that's not the case. It's really finding a balance and kind of, in some ways, I think you almost have to read between the lines in some of the things and try to understand what was the intention. And oftentimes when we talk about bringing back old ceremonies and old aspects of ceremonies, it really is about the intention of those things and not necessarily the little tiny details that may or may not be as important as the intention of those parts of the ceremonies. And so as contemporary Kwakwaka'wakw people, it's looking at this information and from a lens where you have to pick and choose what you feel is appropriate to include in kind of modern renditions or not, and some things you just simply leave in the past because it's not necessarily appropriate to bring certain aspects back into being anymore. But again, that comes with consultations with our old people and other knowledge keepers in our territory. We don't just take these on kind of on its own. We have to consult with these people as well.
Yeah, we still have a few around. Thanks for bringing Chief Peter Knox's name forward today too. That was good memories there. We have an uncle in our territory here who's asked if he could make a comment. And Stephanie's efforting to bring Uncle George on board. So
he's going to join us as a panelist.
There he is. So I see your name come up. So unmute when you get a chance. There you go.
Okay, first of all, I'd like to thank you, Andy and Aaron, for your presentation. It's beautiful. It reminds me of when I wanted to be an artist. I learned the Kwakwaka'wakw style first, and I thought I was getting pretty good at it. And I presented one of my pieces of art to my late uncle Simon Charlie. And he's, oh, that's nice. Where'd you get this? And who made this? And I said, I did. And he's, oh. So he kind of reminded me, he says, we have our own culture. We have our songs. We have our dance. He says, no, with all respect to the art you're doing now, but he says, we can't put those designs on our regalia, whatever. So he really made me think about it. He really did the whole spiel to me about why our Salish art almost went extinct. And, you know, like he said, our old people didn't allow our artists to sell our style of art. So everybody reverted to the Northern style and it almost went extinct. So it really made sense to me. So I really thank you for, I didn't become a rich artist. I wanted to be, but it didn't happen. Now I'm involved with the language and I enjoy, you know, something I didn't want to do before, but now I want to do because we're actually losing our language. But I still like to carve and sketch things and different things. And you just brought back some good memories of when I wanted to be a rich artist. So I'm really thanking you both for your presentation. Just brought back memories of and I
rich artists. I think that's an oxymoron sometimes, Uncle, but thank you. A couple of questions from the chat, if you guys don't mind. One from Carrie, and hopefully I can get it clear here. Was there any explanation of the cannibal suggestion beyond the biting? Well, I'm thinking, Carrie, there is, and it's a really good piece of the book too. And it as you wander through the book, it's there. But Aaron, do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Well, you know, part of what interests me is when in the history of writing about it, it becomes called the cannibal dance. There was, you know, early on, I sort of talk about European obsession with cannibalism. As the Europeans sailed around the world, they went looking for cannibals, and they often found them where they were and where they weren't. And so there was a kind of a European obsession. What's interesting about the Hamat'sa is that its symbolism, at least, is cannibalistic. I mean, there's no way around that. It's in the lyrics of the song. It's in the imagery of the choreography. It's in the stories, the charter narratives that families inherit that authorize the hereditary prerogatives. It is a story about a possession by a man-eating spirit who causes humans to crave humans. However, the point of the dance is to exercise that spirit, right? It's really an anti-cannibal dance more than a cannibal dance. It's a dance to purge the impulse to be a cannibal, but that's not what it was called. And there's a very clear moment in Boaz's own writing in which he starts glossing it in English as the cannibal dance, capitalized, basically translating the term Hamat'sa into cannibal dance. And people have challenged that. There's a similar thing that I talk about with his translation of Bakbaklu Anuksiwe into, he goes through a series of translations, right? He starts off with the man-eater at the mouth of the river. And then slowly over a series of publications, man-eater becomes cannibal, mouth of the river becomes north end of the world. And then the cannibal at the north end of the world becomes the sort of standard phrase that Boaz repeats, and then that everybody after Boaz repeats. But it's a translation, it's a question of translation, right? It's not automatic. And so I'm interested in how this sort of, in how the man-eating symbolism of the dance, which is there, it's incontrovertible, and it was evidenced in part by the biting of audience members in the late 19th century, which people did witness and which dancers reported, and they showed the scars, like that happened. But how that kind of reality in these very circumscribed ceremonial contexts sort of slipped out into this sort of world of representation that became sort of far removed from those contexts. I don't know, Andy, what would you add from that?
I just wanted to say, with the Hamat'sa, it's not necessarily purging of the cannibal's spirit. It's about suppressing it and keeping it down. Because there's always this idea that as a Hamat'sa dancer, that it could rise up again, right? So it's just keeping it suppressed in your spirit, keeping that down, because there's always the danger of it kind of bubbling up and coming back, and so that's always that juxtaposition of the two.
Thanks for that clarification.
Okay.
We've got about 8 minutes left, and there's a few questions in there. So I'm going to jump in with one of the pieces that I'm most interested in with this whole series. And so I'll ask you two as well. Nanaimo Ladysmith Public Schools embarked on this journey, starting with truth and reconciliation, but recognizing that the organization itself had to learn how to be different through the teachings of Salish ancestors and current Salish knowledge keepers. And so some of this path you've been on personally, Aaron, and professionally, and you've got advice from many people across Kwakwaka'wakw territory on how to be a good relative while you're on that territory. And so is there any advice that you would posit for organizations or individuals as they try to walk this path of understanding how to be good relatives on the territories that they're on?
Good question. I feel a bit humbled by it, and I don't know that I'm sort of in a position to offer that kind of advice, but certainly from my own experience as a learner, going into this work with a sense of respect and reciprocity and obligation to give back and to do work that is valuable and useful on the ground in communities. I mentioned, I sort of mentioned in passing how long the dissertation was and how long the book is. And in fact, I think one of the reasons, there's a lot of reasons the book stayed so long. Maybe one of them is that I'm just long-winded, but also, there's a lot written, right? There's a lot written. And I think one of the reasons that I wanted to include as much as I did was because there's so much, because it's so scattered. I didn't want anybody else to have to go on this journey through the library and archive that I did, right? So I wanted to provide a kind of roadmap and to make the texts available, especially texts that aren't widely available, either because they're archival they're sort of inaccessible, they're hidden, or they were unpublished. But I also, it was really important to me to provide intellectual and political and historical context for those texts, so that people not only had access to them, but had some context for interpreting them. And I feel like that in a lot of the projects that I do and projects that I'm working on with Andy, I think that as researchers from outside the communities with connections inside the communities, that providing access, and also some tools to interpret, to make that material useful. So a lot of the appendices, the glossary, the extensive footnotes, all of those are an attempt to make this literature more accessible, with community readers, Kwakwaka'wakw readers in mind. I had a very long, extensive correspondence with the indexer at UBC Press about how to decolonize an index, to make sure the index was usable by including village names and band names and people names as a way for readers into the text. And where Andy and I are going through similar kinds of conversations with this big digital project that we're working on, to do a new edition of one of Boaz and Hunt's key texts, right? How to make the texts and also the archive and collections accessible to the community. And I think that's part of what we as researchers can do to kind of facilitate learning by others.
Thank you, Aaron. Andy, you've walked beside many people who've come to Comox territory and others, and helped them try to understand how to be on that territory. Any advice that you would give for people who are on this path as well?
I don't know. I always like to say to listen more than necessarily asking all the questions. And sometimes when we have things to share, it takes a little while for us to kind of get to the point. And we don't want to be rushed around with these questions and kind of forced to answer them. It takes some work to build up a rapport with people in the community. It takes time, and so I think that's just part of being, respectful of people and people's time, and also valuing friendship and relationships that you build with individuals in the territory. But also, I think it's important to remember that no one person has all the answers. That sometimes I'll learn things from people I wouldn't expect to learn from. There's a lot of people that grew up in our culture and know a lot of little pieces of information and nuggets of wisdom, and sometimes it's the people that you least expect that will know certain things, and it, again, it just takes time and respect of when you're looking for any kind of information. It's about that kind of respect that you bring into it.
I'm sorry we didn't get to all of the questions for the folks who've posed them in there. I see Andrea Lyle, who's from Kwakwaka'wakw territory, has a question in there too. So Andy and Aaron, if you get a chance, please have a look in there. There's some terrific questions that are posed for the research. Our friend Tom Quatten had left us, so we'll close the house by turning it back to Uncle George, if you would close the house for us today, and we can send everybody off in a good way.
Hey, CM na siya ya. Wayne sa kuniti tawa mako. Atan ay ansiya sa wak tana kunan. It's in dealing with the stealing. Jesus, Hijo mi Hamat'sa Jesus, Hijo mi Hamat'sa Jesus, Hijo mi Hamat'sa Swallowing Jesus, Halit stukte I swallow Jesus, Halit stukte I swallow Jesus, Hijo mi lead stukte I swallowing Jesus, Hakoshete I swallow Jesus, Hakoshete I swallow Jesus, Hakoshete I swallowing Haitapa.
Thank you to all our guests, our co-hosts, and our two authors today. It's terrific to see you, and we'll see everybody next time. It was